A lot of the 20th century research and into the 21st century has been in trying to find out how children learn to get themselves into the world, how they learn how things operate in the world, how they learn to put things together. There's an awful lot to think about. How you get dressed to go to school, why you wear different clothes at different times, how you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, whether you have sweet stuff before sour stuff, how you sing, how you act towards people you know versus people you don't know. If you actually think about what you do, you'll realize that you have hundreds of different routines in your mind about how to act. Now, most of the research that started was on simple association, hit, ball, dog, bark, etc. And while it's important at really the age of 2 to be able to do things like that, it doesn't really tell you about how to operate in the world, how to get on the bus to go to school, how to read a book, when to talk, when you're free to scream and run around, when you're free not to, how to deal with unexpected challenges, how to deal with your family as opposed to other people. So something more complicated has to be very important in how we deal with things. And many scientists, psychologists, child development scientists, psychiatrists, have begun to feel that the way in which people learn is in stories. They may be simple stories, like how to go to the drugstore and buy something. They may be complicated stories, like what do I have to do in order to get married, or what do I have to do if I want to be a fireman. But they're still stories. They're things that link events together in a meaningful way. They're not very simple. Of course, it's very important to know how to read. It's very important to know how to use language. But it's also very important to know how all these words, how all these concepts come together in order to make something that's really meaningful for ourselves. The best way to think about this is stories. That we have stories about ourselves, we have stories about other people, we have stories about our life, we have stories about our country's life, we have our stories about political life, etc. And that we key them up, we tell each other them, etc. So it's no accident that stories have been found to be very important in cognitive development. Certain stories, though, are a little different than just the put your clothes on before you go to school type stories. They've occurred and reoccurred throughout the world. They've been shown, for instance, by the author Idries Shah to occur in culture after culture with pretty much the same structure. So, for instance, there's a Cinderella that was invented and told by the Algonquin Indians. There are stories that are pretty universal throughout all cultures, and they've been collected, especially by Idries Shah, for current learning and teaching. Now, why is it important that there are these universal stories? It's because these stories contain important elements of learning for children and for adults, elements that are not really replaceable in any other way. Their very universality shows that they're very important to the basic process of becoming human. This special kind of story is a form of literature that's not very known in the West, but it's been common in the Middle East and Central Asia, especially in countries like Afghanistan, Iran, other Central Asian countries. It helps develop thinking skills and perceptions because it introduces kids and adults to events in unusual combinations. The psychological significance of these stories has only recently, really only in about the last 30 years, been rediscovered in the West. And they're called teaching stories as opposed to the normal kind of stories which kids read Some of the more normal kind of stories may be stories with morals, how to act, how to behave, how to be a proper person. Teaching stories tell you a little more about yourself, how to look at yourself in unfamiliar situations, and they prepare you for the unfamiliar events that may happen later in life, and they develop the mind in unexpected ways. These teaching stories can often appear to be little more than fairy tales or folk tales. In fact, fairy tales and folk tales have at their origin many teaching stories, and this is the way they've been able to seep into the culture. But they're designed to embody in their characters, in their plots, and in their imagery patterns and relationships that nurture a part of the mind that can't be reached any other way. They increase our understanding and our breadth of vision. These are stories that have unusual occurrences in them, unusual things that go on, different ways of dealing with a situation. Most of our daily life is pretty predictable. We have pretty ordinary routines. We get up, kids go to school, they learn at school, they come home, they have their games, they have their life events. These stories are designed to introduce into people, adults and children, unusual events, occurrences that normally don't happen, even in the safe and comforting harbor of a storytelling situation. When they do that, they prepare the mind to develop more flexibility and to understand the complexities of the world a little better. Now, most children won't have encountered so many unusual situations, obviously, but these stories especially get them prepared to look at the world in a more complex way, and a way in which they can develop more context. I've said these stories are very different from ordinary reading and writing, and in order to see how different they were, I set up a series of studies to see what happens inside the brain when people are listening to these kinds of stories. I found that when people are reading teaching stories, it activates the right side of the brain much more than does reading ordinary prose. So if you're reading these stories filled with vivid imagery, filled with unusual occurrences, the right hemisphere of the brain gets more active than if you're reading, say, a history of the Peloponnesian War or more normal reading. Now, why is that important, and what does it mean? There have been a lot of theories for a long time about how the two sides of the brain works, whether the right hemisphere is the really good side and the left is the bad side, etc. But those are much too simple. Think of it this way. Think of the difference between text and context. When you're reading something, you need to know what each and every word means. You need to know where Paris is. You need to know what an airplane is. You need to know that airplane is spelled A-I-R-P-L-A-N-E, etc. But unless you can put everything together, you don't have any context. You just have a bunch of simple words. If you're looking at a room, for instance, what you see is a bunch of lines up and down, left and right. But they don't come together to make a room unless you know that you're in a room. So it's been found in a number of studies that the left hemisphere of the brain deals in lots of different situations with the elements of a situation. The lines that make up a room, for instance, the individual words that make up a sentence. The right side of the brain deals with context, how these words are put together, how the lines are put together to make a room, where you are in space, etc. So meaning isn't part of one side of the brain or the other. You can't have a story without words. You can't have a story also without knowing what the words mean and how they fit together. What this means in these stories is that the teaching stories stimulate the area of the brain that has to do with context. that has to do with putting words together, that has to do with putting things together with relationship to oneself. And this is one reason why they're so important. You ever bought something, you see a picture of a bicycle, you want to buy it for yourself or for your child. It comes from UPS, and there it is. It's a bunch of pieces. They're all laid out. There are a set of instructions, but you can't ride it. You can't go anywhere with it. You can't do anything with it. It's the pieces of a bicycle, but it's not a bicycle. In this metaphor that I'm using, what the left hemisphere does is it kind of produces the pieces. Now, there's a lot of work in producing the pieces of a bicycle, but it's still not a bicycle until someone knows how to put it together. If you're like me, that's not you, but in fact, most people know how to do this. The right side of the brain is the side that puts together the pieces of the puzzle of life. It puts together things into an organized whole wherein we can operate, we can live our life, and we can be prepared to know how to act in different situations. Some of them may be unexpected, some of them may be just routine, but without it, we wouldn't know where to go, we wouldn't know how to go. It would be just like having a bunch of pieces unassembled of a bicycle which nobody ever put together for us. This is context. It's what the stories provide. How to link items together, and this gives the child or an adult a picture of what's going on, how to act, and what may befall him or her in the future. And of course, the act of reading stories to the child also affects the adult. These stories are designed to have effects on both the reader and the person who's being read to. The child may learn to anticipate what's going on in this and many other stories, but the adult may also have his or her mind taken along some unfamiliar lines. These kinds of things are obviously very important for kids in today's world and for adults. And as we work more and more with these teaching stories, we see their relevance to changing circumstances in our life and in the life of our culture, which is why these stories are so continuously interesting and so continuously rewarding. And they not only have an effect on the mind and cognitive development, but on the brain and on future actions of us and our children. Thank you.